Yeah.
Okay, Rich, you try.
No.
You miss it?
Thank you. I'm going to welcome Ken in a minute, but I just want to tell you one thing before, in case I forget. And you can think about it, and then we'll have a chat later on, if it makes sense to anybody. I had an email from a lady called Anne Crombie, asking if it was possible for us to tell her how she could get some school photographs. She was a Rhuddlan girl, school in Rhuddlan, and so on. And that was it. So I answered her and said, well, could you mind telling me when you were in school, what your name was, what your address was, any names of people in your class and so on. And I had in about an hour, I had an answer from her. And I'm just going to read that to you and then leave it with you. It said, many thanks for replying to my email. My maiden name was Morris, so she was Anne Morris. Parents were Evan and Gwen Morris, and I have one brother called Gareth.
I know.
You know, there we are, you see. We grew up at 9 Princes Park, Rhuddlan. But when I was only a baby, then moved to Princes Park when I was about 2.5 years old in 1959. God, I was married in 1959. My grandfather was Thomas Allen Jones. He was a beekeeper, and he had an apiary in the Hendra. Remember the top school more than the infants classes. The friends in my class were Karen Roberts, Gail Williams, Susan Roberts, Cynthia Kelly and Zelda Jones. Names of other people in my class were Derek Hayes, Roy Bentley, Geoffrey Roberts, Ian Adams, Michael Dickinson, Stephen Williams, Angela Such, Jane Woolley, Leslie Kent, Dawn Perry, Delith Morris, Stephen Rafferty. Probably I would remember the others if I saw their faces. The teachers were Miss Foster, Miss Roberts, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Charles, the headmaster. I hope the above information is of use to you and look forward to hearing from you again. So later on, after we're having our cup of tea, if anybody can give me something to scribble on the back and I'll email her back, and we'll tell her how we'll sell her a few photographs. Won't we, Barry?
Well, Ian's age, so the next generation.
Okay, don't talk about her now.
All right.
Only just
All right,
think. All right.
All right,
These ladies, the worst than me. I've got other things to show you, but that'll be later. Sorry, Mr. Ken. What's your name? Do you know why I stopped? My granddaughter was in the air on Saturday, and she was reciting, and she's 5 now, so since about 3 weeks, and we let her do it. But when she was practicing at home, she was doing things like croeso, croeso pawb. Croeso I dod I fama I gwrando arna ni. You know, welcome to come to here to listen to me. And then she'd stand there, she'd do this, and then she'd say a bit. Oh, we thought, my daughter would say, God knows, I don't know if I should let her go. But we did, and you know, she just stood there. She didn't get the stage, but in the prelim she did it beautifully, except she was looking that way. She finished the first verse, and then I could see her looking at the back, and she had a little think, and then she started on the second, and she came straight to me afterwards and said, "Nine, turn your head, that's Rhuddlan Castle behind you." That's what she was looking at the wall. She was looking at the castle. My grandson got the first in the singing, so he's on again. If you want to go to Glenclwyd next Saturday, he's on. Okay, thanks a lot, Ken.
Well, I've started, folks, by passing amongst you a copy of a portion of the OS map of around about 1870, which brings in red the location of what was Charter Press's building when it was owned by the print company. So those of you who are familiar with the area and Rhuddlan in general will be able to perhaps enlighten us on some of its history. But the building itself, when we entertained customers, we used to boast, if you like, on the antiquity of the building, because we had huge beams inside, which were about 12 inches wide and 15 inches deep, go right across the building. Well, those oak trees have taken a hell of a long time to grow from little acorns, so Lord knows when it started as acorns. The building must have been, we perhaps guessed, around about 1700, because the base of it was stone, and then there'd been an additional 2 floors put up in brick above. But if anyone in the audience knows more about the building, I'll be glad to hear it, because we haven't had that filled in our minds ever since we joined the company. And of course, many of the people who passed through had sort of an inkling, oh, you know, they'd seen pictures, etc., etc. Now, I'd like to introduce my 2 colleagues here, Len Glendinning and George Jackson, who work with me. We're still friends, as you can see. And a lot of the stuff that you see on the table, which isn't for sale, by the way, is mostly from Len and some from George. These are nice pictures which are images of the area, and all the stuff on these 2 tables are actually products that were printed in Charter Press, and you can see there's a huge variety, although most of it is book work. And I'll go into the variety of other work that we used to do a little later, but some of them are jolly good examples, and some of them are sort of themselves a bit of a history of the area. And I must apologise for having to read it all, because I'm not used to doing this, and of course I haven't learned it off by heart. So I'm going to read it, and I'll be looking down every now and again. And I put at the top here, this is a story with some digressions which may be amusing. In 1948, 2 print companies in Rhyl, namely Spartan Press of Bodford Street and Vale Press of Tinrhyl Yard, which is car place now, joined together and came to what we knew as Charter Press to start a business. The owners of the 2 companies who were joined up were Mr. Percy Marsden and Mr. Phil Little. Anybody remember them?
Yeah.
Isabel does. Well, Isabel worked with us anyway, so she would know. In 1950 I joined the company as an apprentice when the staff numbered about 14, mostly people from both those companies. Mr. George Jackson started at about 1953, and later on Mr. Glendinning came in 1968 and joined the company as an estimator. I've got to be a little bit technical, whether it goes down well or not, we'll see. But the history of printing is littered with improvements and developments, because it's an industry, and you may find it interesting, but I have to delve into the technical. The method of commercial printing in those days was letterpress. It was called letterpress, and as it describes, it entailed printing with pressure from a raised profile provided by engraved copper plates for illustrations, and type matter, which was largely set by skilled compositors, as they were known. Now, there's a little story which may interest you before I go any further. In about 1952, I had a colleague, apprentice, who Isabel remembered in their moment or so back, who was called Mr. George Batterby. And the boss sent us out one morning, it was a fine morning, a couple of shovels. He said, will you dig out that big post, which had been used as a gate post. So we dug it out. It was a railway sleeper. It went down about 2.5 feet into the floor. In the bottom, we found a spearhead. But of course, without any knowledge, we didn't have any ability to date this, and we were only 2 young lads anyway. So one of the older men said, oh, there's a gentleman in the village who is a bit of an historian, and he has the pharmacy, Mr. O.M.D. Timothy. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
So we took it to him, and he said, oh, I'll look after this, and I'll sort it all out. Well, about 6 years later, nothing had happened. But several years after, I don't know how long, a friend of mine went down to Cardiff on some sort of trip and had time to look at the National Museum. And there was this spearhead found by Mr. O.N.D. Timothy.
Oh! Good see to that.
Yes. But, you know, people are like that, aren't they? And that's what happened to it. But apparently it's... And I haven't seen it myself, but I must do it one day when I go to Cardiff. Right. The spearhead. I've got speculated here. The Rhuddlan battle was 796, was it not? And we reckoned it probably was from that this spearhead was deposited and sort of came to light, you know, an awful long time later. By 1957, the company had expanded. I arrived home from national service to find that an additional building had been added at the rear of the old one. This building still survives today. The older building eventually became a reception area, an office space and a paper store, and the top floor was occupied by our chairman, Mr. Marsden, as living accommodation. The lowest of the 4 original floors was eventually filled in and concreted over, leaving just 3 levels. Part of the new building was fairly soon occupied by all the existing printing machinery, with an additional 2 much larger presses bought second-hand from a Dundee company called D.C. Thompson, famous in the trade. They famously printed the Beano and Dandy comics, and I'll leave you to imagine some of the sarky comments generated by this fact when it became known in the factory. These larger sized presses enabled the company to widen its scope and activities. This led to steady progress through the 60s, and that's why we're talking about the bookwork, because books are never printed 1 page at a time. They're usually done in 16 or even 32 pages, all on 1 sheet. And I'll pass these for you to peruse at your leisure, pass them round. They're just showing you the method of putting so many pages down before it's printed, and then it's folded up and trimmed and finished and becomes a book. It'll all be come to light when you have a look at it. But to look at the paging or pagination, it doesn't make sense. But when you fold it back up again, it does. And if you want a lesson in it, Len will gladly, you know.
Well, the children will love it at school, won't
The
they?
cotton in.
They love making books in school.
A little digression, we did have a tragedy. Mr. Marsden's lady friend, who he lived with, died in very unusual circumstances, very unusual indeed. She had an electric blanket who took a hot water bottle to bed which burst. And she died. Very, very unusual. It didn't half upset things. During this period, the company had developed an exclusive labelling process for use in the abrasives industry, used for identifying cutting and grinding wheel products. This line proved a very lucrative venture after it was developed and refined by ourselves at Charter Press in carefully guarded circumstances. To explain, the process was based on black paper, very, very thin black paper. If you look, mostly people have printers attached to their computers these days. The paper you use in your printers is about what we call in the trade, and still do, 80 GSM. As it gives you an idea of what we call the weight, but it's actually the thickness of the material. The thin tissue paper, which was dyed black, was only 15 grams, so it's less than a quarter. It was very, very thin and wispy, and very difficult to handle. But when the labels were applied, they were applied to the grinding wheels before the firing process that they underwent. It then turned the paper into a black background when it was put onto the actual wheels, and it had been printed with the image or the company's name or whatever in silver ink. And because the silver ink didn't deplete in the firing process. It was a nice clear printed image that got onto the product in the most unusual way, but it was a one-off and nobody else could do it. So in time it grew that we were more or less supplying the whole business in Britain. Now then, our boss, Mr. Marsden, had an inquiry from the States. The gentleman wanted to know all about this. Well, we went round the factory at Wildfire and we could see everybody getting very, very rich because the States is a big place and a huge market. But what happened was, I was asked to come in on the Saturday morning to demonstrate the process to this gentleman, and when this gentleman came in, he saw the boss, Julie, they came downstairs and I was running this press. I have to laugh. Mr. Marsden was standing behind the gentleman, sticking his chest out, and this guy was asking all technical things about how it was going through the press, etc., etc. And as I answered all the questions dutifully, I smelled a rat. But of course, the boss didn't recognise it. So the gentleman went back to the States. We never heard another thing from him. And obviously he was doing all this in the States, so we lost the advantage that had been built up over the years because it was a very special process. Eventually, Mr. Marsden and Little sold the company to two other gentlemen, Mr. G.D. Thomas and Mr. A. Harrison. Mr. Little eventually emigrated to Australia to run an estate agency. He had two sons, one of whom started a business with his partner, Mr. Osborne, to form the Osborne and Little Company, now famous for handmade wallpapers. Mr. Osborne was a family forerunner of George Osborne, our present Chancellor. There's a little bit of an interest there. After a honeymoon period, it became evident that the new partnership was not working, as one partner who had been tasked with managing the company had a problem with his drinking. And after being confronted, he stepped aside, leaving Mr. Thomas with the problem of running the business of which he had no experience. His solution was to offer a partnership to the three of us. Mr. Glendinning stepped into the manager's chair, Mr. Jackson became technical director, and I took on customer liaison. Or bloody liar, as he's known better. Ben's laughing more than anybody because he knows the truth of it. It's fair to say that the whole printing industry is, and was then, rather like a big club, with all the medium and larger sized companies being known to the trade in general. It's not a lie to say that by this time, Charter Press had become a very well-known company, with a reputation for quality work, and was acknowledged as a reputable outfit within the trade, particularly in the northern half of the country, where a huge amount of the most important print companies were located, largely in Manchester and Leeds and Liverpool, etc. By now we had developed an excellent staff, many of whom lived in the village. Isabel?
Joan's mother.
My mother and my son did his apprenticeship with you.
Of course.
Stephen Roberts. And my mother was Mrs. Evans. Mary Evans.
I taught him everything he knew.
Knew somebody had.
Even his wit, because later on I'll give you an example of his wit. He's a good lad, Stephen. But when I say we had developed an excellent staff, many of who lived in the village, and the others lived within easy travelling distance, really. There was almost a family atmosphere, if you can imagine, and even visitors would sometimes comment on this. Our arrangements for the staff included a generous sick scheme, help with work clothing, and at Christmas time an extra week's pay and a bottle of wine for everyone. They didn't drink it on the premises. And we also employed some interesting characters. Another diversion. Does anyone here remember Mrs. Cordiac?
Yes, I do.
Isabel does? Again? Well, her name was Anita, and she was a most unusual character, a lovable character. And to give a little bit of her history, during the war. She was Polish, and she lived somewhere, I never knew where, but I spoke to her one day, and somewhere near to the Russian border. When the Germans came through, she was separated from her husband. She never saw him again, and she had a baby son, and she found herself in Italy as a house help and cook. So she said she understood, but didn't speak Russian, but she understood quite a bit of it. She spoke her own language. She spoke Italian. And at the end of the war, she came here, and she spoke English perfectly well by the time we employed her. So she was a remarkable person in that respect, and she was a jolly good cook as well. I've never had spaghetti bolognese like hers, ever. My wife grinds her teeth when I tell her that, but she was really good. But she had this, you'd have to imagine really, this East European attitude. You know, you see it sometimes in plays and such like, well depicted by someone. But because she was in a foreign language, I suppose, to a certain extent, she spoke in a rather clipped manner sometimes. Now, when she came into work in the mornings, she would come in after 10 o'clock when the other of the ladies would have made us tea, distributed round the factory, and she would collect the tea cups, go and make lunch for us in the boardroom, or any guests that were coming, and then she'd do teas for the folks round the factory, and in the afternoon she would do another cup of tea for everyone, collect, and then go home once she'd washed them up. But if the boys in the print room had a colour change on the press, they would have to wash the ink off the press and put the fresh colour on, which made their hands terrible mess. So with a cup of tea on the shelf, you don't touch it because the cup would go black or whatever it was, bronze blue, dark blue was the worst colour, stay with you for weeks. Now, she would come round to collect the cups, and there it would be, still full, untouched and cold. She would look at the press operator, Stephen particularly, "Why did you not drink your tea?" So the lads called it KGB tips. Not to her face, I might add. But she was a bit special, and I've got another little story which I think we know each other well enough, and it'll pull George's leg. In the boardroom we had a little bureau on the wall which had a bottle of wine unopened for anybody important who managed to come for lunch. There was also half a bottle of whiskey, which remained for years, virtually. And one time, George had a look in this little bureau, and he said, "You know, I'm sure the level's gone down." Well, we didn't know what to say and what to do, so we just
accused you of drinking it.
Yes, he did to begin with, yes. And after that, Len and I both said, well, you know, he said, what are you going to do? I said, well, you do something, George, you've discovered it. Yes, you know, it's tucking away. Because there was only Anita who went into this top room, excepting ourselves. So he tackled her one day. First of all, yes, he
went down a couple of times.
Yes, he went down a couple of times, and then he said, I'm going to mark the bottle. So he did. And a couple of weeks went by. Guess what happened? The level went up.
We didn't bother trying to find out.
So we knew what we had this time, you see. So George said, well, I've got to say something to her. Kindly, of course, you know. So he took her to talk about it upstairs, away from everyone else. And he mentioned what had happened, and the proof really is it's gone up, hasn't it? And sat quiet for a while, and she was sat at the table with him, and she just, well, Hitler's dead. She left the room, which puts it all in context. In a foreign language, you say it all in just 2 words, you know. You're bothered about a whiskey and Hitler, who'd done all that to me. Wonderful, really, you know. She was a really colourful lady. With the expanded space came more and larger printing presses, which in turn gave the company a head start in North Wales, as no other printer had such a large format facility. This in turn required the finishing department to develop its handling capacity, and all these developments required a larger staff, which eventually grew to around 40. So at that time we reckoned we were the biggest employer in Rhuddlan, by a street really. Around the 1960s the industry had begun a revolution in its technologies, both in the areas of typesetting and the method of printing. The typesetting went to a photoelectric system at first, which in turn was superseded some years later by the then newfangled Apple computer. This area was and still is dominated by the Apple computer. At the same time, the letterpress method of print began to be replaced by lithography, which system, despite having been around for many years, had been a more specialist system used in a different area of printing business. Developments in the chemical and other industries had made the system more easily usable for general printers by recently devised methods of photographically prepared images, from which the printed product was achieved. Both of these new technologies were installed as soon as they could be afforded by the company, and this helped to keep the company in the forefront of the new revolution in printing, and all of this meant a good degree of retraining on the job, mostly with local people. The product range became even wider, and this is where we're talking about this. It included brochures, forms, booklets, books, magazines, labels and cartons, which, if you can just imagine, just that list employs a huge difference in thickness of material and all sorts of differences of what was required of the pressman to alter, and the preparation people to know how to put together various things. As those little things, making 16 pages into one piece of paper and eventually trimmed off to find all the pages in the right order.
As long as you numbered the pages.
Pardon?
As long as you numbered the pages.
As long as you put numbers on. And of course the method of doing it was to have fold up,
Yeah.
then number them in the folded up state, and then you've got it right, haven't you, when you open it up. Through the 70s and 80s, the company continued to expand on many fronts. Work came in from many sources, such as a large carton printer in Manchester called Norbury Printers, who passed on prestigious high-quality jobs like limited edition prints and other specialist work. Another line was for the Sainsbury chain, where we printed labels for their baking and custard powder drums. You must have seen them. Usually in 500,000 orders and 4 different kinds. Massive amount of paper. Also, we had in particular a good working arrangement with the Liverpool Print Company, who generated a great amount of business in booklets, diaries and programmes through their contacts with various police authorities mostly. The work was far too much for their own print department, and charter press was their ideal solution. For a good few years we were also able to bid for work at the government stationery office, which, although not very profitable, was very useful at those times of the year when business was quieter, and this in turn made a welcome contribution to overheads. Along the way, we had by now picked up important business with 2 large locally based Japanese companies, both Brother, who you probably all know, and Sharp, who are even better known. And here's a bit of a comical story against ourselves really. We had the Brother attachment, if you like, first, and it was well established, and then I can't remember how, but Sharp got in touch with us, and just like Brother had done several years before, Sharp wanted to run the rule over the company to see if, in their opinion, we could manage to do the large volume of work that they were going to be able to give us. So they arranged to come up and see the company and see how it worked and talk to the staff, etc., which of course we had to say, well yes, come along and have a bit of lunch, etc. So when we realised they were coming on, which day, say Wednesday, On the Tuesday we realised we had a massive amount of work on the floor halfway through being processed. Big sheets in what we call A1, 35 by 25 inches, with 16 pages on, and they're all standing in huge stacks about this high, and there it is, all on show. Wow, we can't let Sharp see all this work from another Jap company. It's going to be disastrous. So all the staff were asked to get some large wrappers for the paper and make little top boxes and put them on all the different piles of paper to hide it. They came in, they had a look at everything, they were nodding and chatting in Japanese, etc. And as they were leaving the factory floor to go upstairs and treat it a bit of lunch, one of the gentlemen accidentally brushed the table and off the top came. Oh, and he shouted something to his colleague in Japanese, and the gist of it was, oh, if they print for brother, they'll be all right for us. We all really did breathe heavily. But you don't think that, you know, but they have this rather curious way of doing things in the way that they have to make sure themselves. And the funny thing was, although it was a print company, they had an engineering department that overlooked things like that. And on one occasion, I've not really got this written down, but on one occasion I was sent out. Glenn said to me, we've got a problem. They don't like one of the jobs we've done. It had a few little blobs, which were like a little blob with a circle around it, which was what we called a hickey. Some foreign body had found itself on the print machine. And I went along, and I was in a crowd of about a dozen at least, in a semicircle, in a room about this size. And each one of these people had to give an account of itself, why it had slipped below their standards. And their standard was, and this will make your hair stand on end, 3 parts per million. Anything more than that was not acceptable. Well, the gentleman from Glasgow who was making, I forget which, but something like half a dozen of the letters on the typewriter, he'd got a problem with his 3 parts per million, and he wasn't convincing with his answers because he'd obviously got a problem. Various people with various different ways of explaining themselves and difficulties with making it make sense. And last was Joe Soap. And while these guys were making their excuses, if you like, it suddenly dawned on me this wasn't very fair. So when it came to me, I thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. And I said, well, I don't think that your 3 parts per million really should apply to us. And there was a little Japanese gentleman who was the gaffer, who you could see his eyebrows raised, but he'd not said a word all the way through. And his kind of interpreter made sure that he understood what had been said. So I was asked to say why. And I said, well, if you go through one of our books, which was something like 32 pages of A4, that size, you'll find probably maybe 1,500 characters on one page, times 32, etc. So I said, you know, if 3 parts per million is applied to us, it's a whole different kettle of fish, because our product coming to you as one piece is already an assembly. The Japanese guy heard the interpretation and he nodded, and he just pushed me on the elbow and said, that's all right. They wanted us to improve what had gone wrong, but at the same time he understood. And it's that one of the difficulties of talking with people in a hugely different language, but they've taken the trouble to learn at least some of it, you know, and you think to yourself, wow, they've come a long way, but they're not all nasty people that we heard of in the war, because he could see the point, and he sort of stood down, you know, he wasn't on his high horse at all. So you have a different respect for people when they treat you like that. We had one, I might well tell you now, then we had one customer who came in one day, and he was from Conwy, most peculiar chap, Mr. Williams, and he was very curt, like a sergeant major, and what he wanted us to do was to print 10,000 pound notes and 10,000 10-shilling notes. Well, it was like milk and magnesia, to be quite honest with you. And we thought, what on earth is he on about? So I took him in our little room and asked him to sort of explain exactly what it was. Well, he came up with a sort of pattern of, does anyone remember the old pound notes? With like two ornate picture frames. One with the Queen or the King, whatever before, and then the price in the other one. But he had that sort of thing. And his reason for coming to ask for these things to be printed on, obviously not on the right sort of paper, it just was like a poor facsimile of the original. It was because he was convinced of his historical work that he'd done, that the paper notes, banknotes, was a Welsh invention, and not by anybody who was in a bank or anything like that. It was the Welsh drovers who used to take sheep from the mountains in the middle of Wales usually, and take it right down to London, and of course to keep the sheep alive and well they had to feed. So they'd go to a farmer, ask could they use this, that and the other field for the night, and then move on. But he couldn't pay them, farmers, because they had no money. When they went to London, they were then paid in hard coins, and on the way back they settled with the farmers because they didn't want to have to go round him the next time. Now he reckoned that that was how banknotes started, and there was a huge convention going on in Chicago. He was going to go to it, and he was going to lay the law down and demand that all the banks in all the world should pay him some money on behalf of his, original design. Whether it was true or not, I wouldn't have to say.
I saw QI, I think it was, and that came up in that, and that was in Wales where the first banknotes were. There was an inn, they used to stop at on the way back, and this inn had a safe, and they used to leave their money with him, and that, they reckon that was the first
There we are,
one.
that perhaps verifies it a little bit at least. And the way of delineating between a pound note and a 10-shilling note was that the pound note had a picture of a U, and the 10-shilling note had a picture of a lamb. So they were different. And we did the job. We actually printed this.
We did it.
Yes, we did the job eventually. But I must say, he in all of my life, he's the most the man who was treated his wife the most terribly I've ever seen.
Oh.
He was appalling. He'd have thought she was a dog. Oh. He wouldn't let her come in for a cup of tea. She sat in the car. When they went back out, he was shouting at her in the car because she was sitting in the wrong seat or something. He wouldn't try on my missus, he'd be dead. In we really were very wary to start with, but we did the job, and because obviously it was not on the right paper or anything like that, they couldn't have been really mixed up with the real thing. But he had a real bee in his bonnet, this chap, he really did. And I'm not surprised that the people in Chicago saw him off. They must have put him straight back on the airplane, I would have thought. However. Right, so the boardroom arrangements at the company now, we were involved, remained for 17 years, with the chairman, Mr. Thomas, leaving all of the running of the company to we three working partners, and just visiting the company on a weekly basis for a couple of hours. Right, Isabel? Just do a bit of lunch and he'd gone. In 1992, there was a serious fallout. At the time of Mrs. Thatcher's dictum that there was no recession, this of course was followed a couple of weeks later by the Chancellor and others announcing that there was in fact a recession. In turn, this led to one customer reducing the amount of work which we did for him by attempting to keep most of his work, or more of his work, in-house. This spooked the chairman. We three had designs on countering the current problems by purchasing a multicolour press, which in our opinion would have enabled us to ride out the looming recession and at the same time position the company to enable it to make serious inroads into the then burgeoning colour printing market, as we had the skills and the experience to start using the press almost immediately. Unfortunately, this idea brought cold feet to the chairman, and he refused to support our plans, and for the first time in 17 years began to interfere in the day-to-day running of the company. We fell out for the first and last time, and as he was the majority shareholder, he decided to sell the company. This appeared to be an attempt to bring us to heel, and he was nonplussed when we agreed. Suffice it to say that some months later, when the sale contracts were to be signed at a Manchester solicitor's office, he actually tried to reverse his decision at the 11th hour. But of course it was far too late. What I believe had finally dawned on him was the bold fact that for 17 years, which contains 68 quarters, each quarter we had a review of the profit and loss situation. Only one of those quarters had shown a bit of a loss, and that was at the time of the Thatcher recession bit. In fact, at this point, in the early 90s, the company was turning over 1.1 million annually. Now that's quite something for a print company, even today. And I put it in Rhuddlan, believe it or not, you know, it's a little village and all this stuff being pouring out. So the company was sold to a new partnership of Messrs Morris and Maddox, who failed within just over a year to control the cash flow. George and Len by this time had retired, and I'd been kept on merely to, you know, keep the customers and link. They singularly failed to impress almost all the customers. With one of the gentlemen particularly, was a very high-handed person, and locals just did not like him. And I had a very embarrassing situation of sitting at my telephone, people ringing in and swearing and cursing and otherwise making their point of view known, that they didn't want this bloke to go there again, and he was my new boss, so very difficult to tell him that, especially with his kind of attitude about himself. He was always boasting about the fact that he had run a printing company for Robert Maxwell. The boys in the factory argued, would you believe? Some of them used to say, naturally, that Maxwell had taught him all his own ways. The more witty said, we think maybe he taught Maxwell. But the ultimate was Stephen again. He said, but he didn't teach him to swim, did he?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I was just going to say that.
Right, so he really, he ran the company down in short order. Really, it only lasted about 12 months before the writing was on the wall, and it was on everywhere else as well. He wouldn't listen to anybody's advice or anything, so it was curtains really. And inevitably, within a short time, the company had to be sold again, this time to an outfit from the northwest, whose obvious intention was to asset strip the company and take the work to their parent company. What they didn't know was that when this county was Clwyd, which you'll all remember, the Clwyd County had helped to set up the two Japanese companies with grants, and they were a big help, and the Japanese were very mindful of this help that they'd had. And of course, taking that work up to near Manchester would have meant that the people in Wrexham, Sharp and Brother would have carte blanche there to take the work anywhere else, because it wasn't in Clwyd, it wasn't even in Wales. And when I explained this to the new people, they did go a bit white, but they were the sort of people who thought, oh, you know, talking rubbish. And of course, you know, it was going downhill very quickly. So what happened, in fact, was the asset stripping took place bit by bit. They had a parent company. They had loads of reps on the market, which entails lots of cars. All the bills for all the cars came into Charter Press. It's the start of things, you know. Put all the bills and all the owings to this company and declare it a useless whatever, which wasn't at all fair, but you know, that's how some people do their business. So they disappeared, and the old building was later purchased and used by a builder's merchant, who I think probably everyone knows about that now, don't they, in Rhuddlan. But it's now, the old building's been demolished, and now it's a little bit of Rhuddlan history. I'd like to illustrate two different attitudes to work which we experienced over the years. They're just little stories really, which tell you what a damn good staff we had and what you as ratepayers and taxpayers have to pay for, I think, even yet. We used to do quite a lot of work, as I mentioned, about government work, or as it was known, HMSO, Her Majesty's Stationery Office. And usually the jobs were, they supplied their own paper. So this job came in and it was for the DVLC in Swansea. As my memory is not very clear about it, but I do believe the job was about 400,000. It was a big job, printed in about 3 different colours. When we finished it, and for some reason, the van driver wasn't available. And we had a big van, like the big Sunblessed wagons, you know, 3.5 ton. And this needed to be delivered to Swansea. So it went off, and I think it was a little bit on the late side. So it went off, and the driver came back. And a few days later, not very long, Len had a call to say there was something badly wrong with this job. So he said to me, you'll have to go down and see if you can sort it out, because the people at the other end wouldn't really explain properly, would they? So I set off in the car. It's a long way, Swansea. I got there just after lunch. The guy on the gate obviously knew I was on the way, because as soon as he saw me and I said who I was from, oh yeah, go in. And there were 2 levels of this massive building, which you've probably all seen pictures of. It's very high, big skyscraper affair, and 2 levels underneath the ground were the printing, the packaging and processing of all the print they'd bought in on American machines, which had an unusual device where it flicked open an envelope and the little leaflet was thrown up and changed direction and was thrown into the envelope. It was a terrific machine, but it wouldn't work, it wouldn't pick these leaflets up. And as I was shown this problem, the foreman of the department was very concerned, very serious. And there was a young woman who was sitting about 10 yards away at a table with a cup of tea and a newspaper and a fag. And she was the operator of the machine, which had been deemed to be, you know, wrong. So I looked at this problem, and it was quite simple. The hopper, where there was a big pile of leaflets in it, our leaflets, the hopper was too tight against the 2 ends. So I said, well, that's what's wrong with it. It looks to me as if the hopper just needs perhaps 1/2 mil or what, moving out. So I reached to take this butterfly knot and move it a little. Well, there was a hell of a furore. Don't touch it, I'll send for the engineer. So it doesn't need an engineer, a little girl could have done it. But the engineer had to come. And he did after about 20 minutes, and this young lady was still back and reading the paper. So when I told the engineer what he needed to do, he saw the point immediately and moved this little gadget, pressed the button, machine flowed out. Well, if that girl's eyes could have been mechanized, she'd have drilled 2 holes in me, because she was really annoyed that she had to start work again. Now, you know, that wouldn't have happened at Charter Press, because you know, we had an entirely different thing. that went on. And so the second illustration is the other side of the fence when you're working for a private company.
Can I stop you a minute?
Sorry?
You know all these papers you sent down to DVLC?
Yes.
I drove them.
No.
I just moved to the area. A job fell through, and I was doing part-time with Panic Link,
Yes.
and they had to pick all your forms up and take them down to Swansea.
Well, there we are. That's a verification, isn't it? Now, the people I mentioned about the company...
You're not going to late that day, didn't you?
Yeah, you should have seen the holes in Swansea. They were redoing the place.
It's an attitude of mind, isn't it? You know, paying these folks. So, Charter Press, different attitude altogether. We had this company in Liverpool who were basically, they had their own printing department. It wasn't very big, but basically there were a lot of tele-ads people upstairs collecting ads over various products all the time. And one particular product had gone very, very slowly, or they'd forgotten to put it in the train or whatever. So, on the Saturday morning, the programme was supposed to be distributed to the public at the venue. And we had Friday to do the whole job. And on the Thursday, nobody had got an advert in at tea time. So the company in Liverpool kept their people on, obviously a bit of overtime, to sell adverts to places which are open, I suppose, pubs, chip shops, whatever. And they sold adverts at about 9 o'clock at night, in the knowledge that when they transferred them over to telephone in the morning, which now had been brought forward at Charter Press to 6 o'clock in the morning. So our compositors, typesetters, went in at 6 o'clock, got all this info, started typesetting, and at about 10:30 managed to convert it all into plates to put on the presses, and the presses, the boys in the press room were asked to stagger their lunch so that they could continue the work. It wasn't a huge job. So they printed the job over lunchtime, and the paper was there laid drying for a while. Then it was folded, then trimmed and packed. And I phoned my missus to say that I was having to go and deliver this job. Don't put anything in the oven. Would you like to come with me? Yes, she said, I'll come with me, thinking to the pool, whatever. She said, where are we going? I said, Bristol. What? So, we went to Bristol with this in the back of the car. And we got to the fire chief, who was the man who had to go to, in his personal home in, what's it called, Keynsham, which is a suburb. And we found the address. It was about 8:30 at night. He was absolutely astonished. And of course I was trading now under the other company's name, not Charter Press. And so he said, will you thank everybody? Because it was a marvellous effort. He wasn't expecting to get it until late on Saturday morning. It was a big fair sort of thing that was going on, and the fire service were people who were organising it. So everybody in Charter Press had a hand in that job that particular day. Mind you, we had to sort of stop various jobs. But that's a different attitude entirely, isn't it, from the public servant, if you like. And really, it sort of says it all in many ways. So, apart from the connections and business customers I've mentioned to date, I could finish with 2 lists or 3 lists from our collective memory, which, although a long way from an exhaustive list, will give you an idea of what Rhuddlan and a damn good staff can do when the chips are down. Apart from all this, of course, which is an illustration in itself. Starting way back, we actually produced the invitations for the opening of the world's first nuclear power station in Latina in Italy. That was produced in Rhuddlan. And practically all the world's leaders were there to see this newfangled thing. And it wasn't big, something like 500 invitations. But you know, it's one of those things that sticks in your mind because it was so worldwide important. Some of you may remember the world famous Flying Scotsman railway engine when it was being taken to the States to show it off. Does anyone remember that? Yeah, I do. You do? We printed the brochures for that venture. We printed workshop manuals for Rolls-Royce, and also we printed their handbook for chauffeurs, which was almost like a bit of a cartoon to read, you know, I mean, the things they had to do or not do. And one year we actually printed the House of Commons visitors' tickets, which were a very awkward job because each row had to have its own number, and almost everything was a different something or other from the next label, as you can say. Lastly, or almost lastly, a quick run around the memory brings an almost countrywide list of our delivery scope and the areas which we delivered to, which in itself builds a picture. And of course there are lots of smaller places as well, but Liverpool, Manchester, Stockport, Chester, Leeds, Bradford, Newcastle, Whitley Bay, Sheffield, Nottingham, Derby, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Bristol, Swansea, Cardiff, Slough, London, East Sussex, Chelmsford, Bury St Edmunds, Watford, Cambridge and Peterborough. There are many others, but that's just one sort of quick whip round some of the places that went through my memory. Many others, of course. And really lastly, the languages which we printed, not doing anything other than getting in translations, obviously a lot of the time, but French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Serbian, Croatian, Japanese, Mandarin, Malayan, Urdu, Siamese, and of course Welsh and English. So we had quite a wide field of activity over all those years. And of course it ceased with us, as it were, in the early 90s. Well, thanks for listening.
Wow, that was good.
All these things, I personally think, of all these things here, this is the most natty. It's George's. See that?
Oh, yeah.
It's a map of London, and it was all processed at Charter Press from the original sort of map that we were given as copy, but it curls up like a flower. And I mean, it goes into the pocket really if you've got a large jacket. It was for a gentleman who was Dutch, wasn't he, the gentleman?
Yeah.
But he operated out of London. Everything was done at Charter Press, save for the coating here, which is a specialist thing we used to have done in St Helens, this glossy coating. But even the dye here, which was like, these are actual perforations, the dye was put through in Charter Press as well. We had lots of different machinery, etc. So have a look at all these, but they're not for sale, unfortunately. Thanks.
Would anybody like to? I'm sorry, would anybody like to ask Ken any questions or notes anything that you
Yes, if I can't do it, these two can chip in.
What stuff? Right, exactly what I was going to.
The paper was bought in from various places. In fact, Len was mostly involved in that. The question was, where did all the paper come from? As I say, the stationery office stuff they would supply.
Paper came from those. We did get a small amount, very small amount, direct from water, like
You didn't use oak.
failed to escape
No, specialist again, obviously. But what interestingly, I couldn't put this in the narrative really. The black paper we used was being made in Britain, in the Solway Firth. And the local council and various other people put the block on it, on the person who was making it, because the fishermen complained the fish couldn't see because the black dye was going in the ocean. So we finished up with that being made in Norway, and directly to us, you know. Very expensive stuff, of course.
It's amazing. Well, I thought you knew a lot. I thought you'd done, not knowing a lot, but they'd done a lot. But I had no idea, did it?
He's forgotten a lot.
Has he? Come on then, second half.
He's forgotten more than he's told you tonight. I'm telling you.
Really?
He's left quite a bit
Some
out
of the
there.
naughty bits, especially.
We used to print the British Airways boarding passes
Yes,
at one time.
I did.
And we used to send those all around the village to
There's a lady
to
here.
ladies of leisure who
Somewhere,
used
there's a
to
lady in here who
collate them into sets.
helped.
We had an outwork going in the village. She used to take
Oh,
it
she
round.
comes with it.
Quite a few of the girls
Oh,
in the
yeah,
village
they
used
did.
to do
They
the
did.
outwork, didn't they?
Yeah.
For years
Yeah.
we did the British Airways boarding passes. Before they went all digital, you know.
Oh, I still need a boarding pass.
Oh yes. And
Well,
stuff and all sweet wrappers and things.
Yes, we did an awful lot. It's just so much of it, you know.
and different
it's a long,
sorts of things.
Yes, and it's over a long period as well,
Yes,
isn't
yeah.
it? You know, and,
Yeah.
you tend to rack your brains. I mean, that 4 pages started off as 2. And it's been
You look
reprinted
again,
about
yeah.
5 times to get because it kept on swelling. You know, go to bed at night. Oh, I've forgotten so and so. You know, but it was interesting actually going through it to a large extent. And Len and George sort of finalised 1 or 2 things that I was not
Yeah.
very sure of.
Can I just ask, did anybody, Ken asked at the beginning about the actual building, the stonework and the brickwork. Anybody have any recollection of heard of anything
Anyone in the audience
that,
know anything about the
what it was
history?
like before?
They're all too young.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're all too young.
And we didn't take any, unfortunately, any internal shots, apart from 1 or 2 on the table.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah.
And
Those
when
are in
we
the new
think back,
building, aren't they?
the length of time we spent in that building, you'd think we'd have had a better.
You would. You would really.
I mean, we did our best.
You were busy though,
Len
weren't
in
you?
particular, we did our best to keep that building in its as near as the original state
Yeah.
as it had ever been. We refused to put plastic windows in the old building. We wouldn't do anything like that. We didn't change the size of the windows.
You know,
No.
We kept the old stone slabs on the roof,
yeah.
and look what they've done to it now.
Tom
Yeah.
Slate.
It's a disgrace.
And on the other side of
Terrible,
things,
that
of course,
side.
we were
The view from the
regularly
castle
paged
now,
about making the building a listed building. Because
Yes,
it
well,
qualified.
exactly.
I can
But
never
of course-
understand stood why it wasn't.
No,
We thought
no.
it was, but it wasn't. We did inquire about that.
It is, having a building listed is a very complicated
Yeah, but we were
system.
prepared
And
to
yes.
go along with all those complications.
Yes,
and
yes.
put it in
But we've
provision.
tried since we tried with the laundry, and the day they came down from the Royal Commission to have a look at it, the demolition men were here at the same time.
It's a disgrace now what
Yes.
they've done to that riverbank on that side.
Yes,
you're right.
It's absolute eyesore now.
Yeah.
You come down the high street of the village now and look across there, I could weep.
Yes, yes, you're right. And on that, when you go up on the bypass and look down.
Just
We
like
hope
a
it won't
rubbish
be
tip.
like that. Okay, Mike?
Having told us about this valuable custom we had from our Japanese people, did local industry use you at all, such as Real Urban District Council and Prestati?
Yes,
They did?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
that's pleasing.
yes. Well,
Good.
I did think about putting at the bottom of the list where we delivered to, I was going to put a grill, you know.
Not a lot. Not a lot. because we-
Not a lot, no.
We did have a bit of a row with them on one occasion, on several occasions, because they were handing out the annual
Holiday guide,
holiday guide.
Oh, yeah.
sending it to Norwich and places
And
like
Hull,
that.
Hull of all places, it couldn't be further away.
At one time, we used to print the general guide, the small leaflet for Liverpool at Charter
Oh yes,
Press.
that's right.
And we did it for, I think, about 3 years. And then our lovely friend, Mr. Derek Hatton, and his partner decided that they wanted to keep it in-house, even though they paid an awful lot more for the job. So we lost the job for no good reason, really. But that was the thinking, you know, keep it in Liverpool, as it were. I mean, the company that we used to do a lot with, the books, etc., very often I would have to nip to Liverpool early in the morning, perhaps get there about 9 or 9:30, and it was incredible. The factory was on the bottom floor, of course. You would probably, if I went in the factory, the guy who sort of managed the place was a very helpful chap, a lovely guy, and he would perhaps have to nip out and get something that I'd asked for, you could look through, and the boys in the factory were not working at all. And he used to say to me, they just didn't start at 10:30 because they talked about the football match.
Especially last night.
Yeah, and one of the lads in the factory, whose very pretty wife was the receptionist, he followed Liverpool, and apparently he announced that he'd been everywhere to all the away games in the whole season, and he hadn't paid a penny on the railway because he knew his way in and out of every station around the country to get in and out, and obviously knew the dodge in the train, nip into the toilet and ticket collector's gone. He knew it all, and apparently he made the boast that he hadn't paid a penny for the whole season, which is, you know, it's quite something really. Jealous. Yes.
You said early on that you had problems with dark blue as being an ink that...
Yes, what we call bronze blue.
Bronze blue, right.
Which is like, we probably call it French Navy, the ladies would call it French Navy. And the bronze had a little bit of a tinge of red in it, so that it had a bronzy look. That stuck in your fingers for weeks. You know, it was awful really.
Right. But what I was going to ask is, did you print a whole booklet in that colour, or did you do multicolour by putting the paper through different times?
We did, and that's what when I referred to buying a multicolour press, which is what we had in our minds.
That would have done it in one pass, would it?
Go through in one pass of 4 different colours, and one of the advantages, of course, you don't have to wash that unit because it's got yellow on, then this has got black on, that's got blue, that's got red, whatever. You don't have to wash that up, so you put more and more jobs on all day, and you don't have to wash the ink off, and that of course saves you probably half to 3/4 of an hour each time. So, you know, in a day, if you've got a few small jobs, you could save a couple or 3 hours. And of course, we just didn't get the message across, you know.
We did have, we had 2 colour presses, you know.
2 colour.
Do 2 at once. Then when he did a 4 colour process, John, like full colour, that's 4 colours, you know, yellow, red, blue and black.
Yeah.
We do 2 colours, and then pass the whole thing through again with the other 2 colours, you know, and hope the paper hasn't shrunk or stretched.
Yeah, you've got to get the registration line, haven't you?
The colours you use, the colours you use, of course, black is the final one, but not quite the same as that. That's what we call magenta, it's a bit more translucent than that. Then there's cyan, you know, cyan blue, and of course yellow and black, and from those 4 colours you get all the colours you see in a colour photograph. You look at it under
the tone of the colours, the cartridges they use on the...
That's right.
That's
right. Yes. So it's just been, you know, transmitted onto those different kinds of machines. But it's quite complex, but nowadays the machinery is fantastic because, you know, the bigger the machinery any company has, the more it swallows, you know, and the bigger it is, the more it costs. So the more likely they are to go on 24-hour shifts rather than 8 or 16 hours. And so it goes on and on and on. And nowadays, I think it's in anything that requires big machinery, and not just printing, the modern habit in big companies is not to buy anything. It's merely hired or from the manufacturers, and then when it's due to come out, it goes to Nigeria or South Africa or whatever. And you know, it's the way the world's going, really. Can't say we miss it, but we had fun doing it sometimes. It was great fun.
I remember,
it really was a good...
I remember the first New Year, I think it was, Ian, I was going out, the first year Stephen was working for you. And I was waiting for him to come home because he was going to keep an eye on his younger sister while I went out for the first time in years. Come home drunk. Not me, Stephen. So I couldn't go out because I was worried about him because he was sick and drunk. That's
your fault, the way she's looking at it.
We had one gentleman who sadly died some months ago. He used to work in the factory, and at one time, boss took on a young fellow from Rhuddlan who was quite poorly with, what do you call it, Oh dear me.
Who told?
What?
Pardon?
Who told?
Diabetes?
No, not diabetes. He'd faint, as it were, you know.
Epilepsy.
It was like an epileptic, yes. And of course, sometimes they get what they call the aura, don't they?
Yeah,
Which is
that's
sort of halfway.
Yeah.
And he was on a machine and he was washing it up, and it was red ink, that sort of colour, and he was washing off. And in about half an hour, he was covered in red because he had gingerish hair. He was covered in his hair everywhere. And you know, the boss, we told him about it, and they had to sort of get rid of him in a kind way. And he finished up being a typewriter engineer, if you like, and of course typewriters didn't last very long after that. But the funny thing was, the chap who used to work there from Stoke was a real Potteries accent, and he had a bit of a wit. And at lunchtime, the boys would go out and have a game of football against the garage door, you see. And this lad, poor lad, he couldn't really kick a football at all, but he joined in and he enjoyed it. And of course the ball would run towards him. On one occasion he took a hell of a swipe at the ball and missed it completely, and sort of ran against the doorway, and because of his impetus he went round about 3 times on the doorway, you see. And this chap from Stoke, Gilbert, there was an awful pause while nobody knew what to do, and he said, "Here, less of the fancy stuff, we're only ordinary blokes." Get them, don't you?
Well, I'm going to suggest that you have your cup of tea.
Oh, how nice.
You have a chat. Would you like to have yours first, because you're
Oh,
our
no,
guest?
no, not all right.